Welcome to Isaiah 2, 22 Triads of Enlightenment. What if the collapse of your world was not a catastrophe but a revelation? What if the structures you most trusted, your systems of power, your symbols of success, even your forms of worship, were not merely flawed, but fundamentally misaligned with reality itself? Isaiah 2 is not a warning shot fired into the future. It is a present unveiling, a prophetic lens that exposes the spiritual architecture beneath every human civilization, ours included. This chapter does not speak in abstractions. It names names. It identifies the real idols, not only golden statues, but the exaltation of human will, the worship of form over essence, the seductive illusions of culture, wealth, and self-reliance. And it does so with an unrelenting triadic logic, revealing how each reality is constructed and how, when misaligned, it must unravel. These are not scattered verses, they are interlocking revelations. In triad after triad, Isaiah shows us what it means to be truly human, and what happens when we forget. Here, prophetic insight becomes spiritual anatomy. Revelation emerges through relationship. Justice confronts illusion not with rage, but with clarity. Every height not rooted in the divine is destined to fall, not because God is angry, but because reality cannot uphold what is not true. The breath in man's nostrils cannot sustain what only God can give. Traditional readings of Isaiah 2 often drift toward utopian idealism or historical reductionism, missing the intricate dynamics within Isaiah's prophetic vision. Our approach is distinct. We probe the chapter through carefully structured triads, each revealing complex interplays of affirmation and negation, coherence and disintegration, divine presence and human distortion. By examining Isaiah's text through this rigorous triadic logic, we uncover deeper insights into the nature of prophecy, the fragility of human pretension, and the relentless restorative power of divine truth. In doing so, we invite you not merely to observe Isaiah's vision, but to step into it, to see clearly the dynamic interactions shaping the fate of communities, the meaning of worship, and the inevitable collapse of every illusion that separates humanity from reality. Verse 1. The word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw upon Judah and Jerusalem. This opening verse is deceptively simple, but it sets in motion a pattern of triadic logic that will structure the entire chapter. Isaiah does not merely hear a word, he sees it. This paradox introduces us immediately to a prophetic mode of knowing that goes beyond auditory reception. The word here is not just spoken instruction, it is a manifest truth, made visible through spiritual cognition. Isaiah the prophet becomes a unique site of convergence. He is the son of Amoz, his role is inherited and relational. He is a prophet, his task is vocational and divinely commissioned, and he speaks to Judah and Jerusalem. His message is not abstract, but directed to a covenantal people and place. These three together, revelation, vocation, and setting, form a stable field through which the word can appear in history. It is not generated from within Isaiah alone, nor is it dropped randomly from heaven. Rather, it emerges from the living interaction of divine intention, prophetic subjectivity, and sacred geography. In this triadic arrangement, we encounter a structure of coexistence. Revelation is not one-sided. It depends on a prophet capable of faithful perception, a divine source intent on communication, and a cultural spiritual matrix that can receive and embody it. This is what makes the word visible. Not just that God speaks, but that the conditions for discernment are actively present in the prophet and his context. The word, then, is not an isolated utterance. It is the emergent clarity that arises when all three elements coexist in balance. It is a phenomenon of relational logic, not detached information. Seen rightly, the opening line is not an introduction, but a model. It demonstrates that divine truth manifests only through real persons, in real places, through the ongoing structures of covenantal vocation. Verse 2. It shall be in the last days, that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be prepared in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. Although this verse is often read as a hopeful prophecy of future restoration, its logic is rooted in a present negation. The very fact that this exaltation of Mount Zion is described in future tense reveals that it is not currently the case. At the time of Isaiah's writing, the mountain of the Lord is not the highest place, it is not where the nations are flowing. Instead, this hopeful vision implicitly reveals a world out of order. Other mountains, symbols of rival powers, ideologies, and pretended authorities, occupy the space that should belong to the divine center. The sacred geography has been dethroned. The house of the Lord, rather than standing as the fixed axis around which the world orients itself, has been overshadowed by false elevations. The true spiritual center has been displaced. This is not the absence of structure, it is the presence of a negated equilibrium. What should be the stable triad of revelation, vocation, and sacred center has not disappeared. It has been inverted. In place of revelation, there is ideology. In place of the prophet, there are self-authorizing figures, kings, mystics, merchants, who speak not for God, but for their own agendas. In place of Zion, there are other high places that command global attention, commanding flows not of repentance and instruction, but of power, distraction, and allegiance. This false triad maintains the form of structure. It even attracts multitudes. But it does so while excluding the truth at its core. It mimics sacred order while refusing divine instruction. The nations still flow, but they flow toward counterfeit heights. Thus, this verse is not just a promise of what will come, it is a judgment on what is. It names a world held in stasis, not by absence, but by the persistent durability of misalignment. It teaches us that when the true structure of revelation is lost, it is not replaced by chaos, but by a perverse kind of order, one that is stable, attractive, and spiritually empty. This is the logic of negated equilibrium. The center still holds, but it holds nothing. Isaiah's vision does not begin by describing an empty world waiting for God. It begins by diagnosing a world full of structures that seem exalted but are devoid of truth. Only when that false order is undone can the house of the Lord truly be raised. Verse 3. And many people shall go and say, Come, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Here we see a triadic structure of spiritual restoration that unfolds as a living process, not a mere assertion. First, the people themselves initiate a movement. Come, let us go up. This invitation is not top-down, it originates among those who have heard the call and now seek something higher. What they seek is not vague transcendence, but a specific destination, the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob. This return to place is also a return to instruction. They go not to behold, but to learn. He will teach us his ways, suggests a pedagogy rooted not in speculation, but in righteousness, in revealed patterns of life. But the triad does not end in hearing. It culminates in action. We will walk in his paths. That phrase bridges the space between divine speech and human conduct. It suggests not simply obedience, but alignment. Walking in the paths means embodying what has been taught, letting divine instruction shape daily movement. And this movement is not limited to private ethics. It radiates outward as the law goes forth from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Zion and Jerusalem become not only geographic symbols but centers of spiritual transmission, broadcasting divine instruction outward into the world. This structure exemplifies the logic of reinforcement. Desire, come, once turned upward, initiates instruction, teach, and instruction transforms into action, walk. Each element strengthens and expands the others in a self-reinforcing cycle. The more people walk in the way, the more others are drawn to the mountain. The more the law goes forth, the more the paths become visible and accessible. The structure builds not toward climax, but toward durability. The triad shows that true discipleship is a recursive, sustaining pattern. Each moment of faithful action supports the next. This is not simply morality, it is the regeneration of a world through alignment with truth. Verse 4. And he shall judge among the nations and rebuke many people. They shall break their swords also into mattocks, and their spears into scythes. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation, neither shall they learn to fight any more. This verse is often read as a utopian image of peace, but its logic is far more complex and sobering. The peace envisioned here is not the absence of violence, but the consequence of judgment and rebuke. These are not gentle corrections. They are confrontational acts aimed at restoring moral balance. The fact that swords must be broken into agricultural tools suggests that war has become so habitual that disarmament is not passive, but active and forced. The instruments of death are not set aside, they are shattered and repurposed. Peace here arises only because violence has been confronted and rendered dysfunctional. This is the reversal of the previous triad. Where the movement in verse 3 was upward, toward instruction, righteousness, and aligned action, this verse responds to a failure of that very movement. Those who did not go up to the mountain, who did not seek instruction, now find themselves subject to divine arbitration. He shall judge among the nations implies a third-party intervention, a necessary insertion of divine clarity into systems that have collapsed into conflict and disorder. The law has not been received willingly, now it arrives through rebuke. The structure here follows the logic of feedback, not in the sense of commentary, but as corrective reversal. Systems that fail to align with truth begin to devour themselves. War breeds more war, and the inability to learn peace becomes a self-perpetuating dysfunction. The breaking of weapons signals not just the end of violence, but the end of the capacity to learn violence. Neither shall they learn war anymore is not a poetic flourish. It is a diagnostic statement. Learning has been redirected. Instruction in righteousness must now be enforced through disillusionment. This verse shows us that divine justice is not reactionary, it is systemic. When the reinforcement cycle of discipleship fails, a feedback loop emerges that becomes increasingly destructive until the only remaining remedy is external intervention. Peace, in this context, is not the natural state of human relations. It is the result of hard correction. Judgment becomes the grace that disarms, and rebuke the mercy that interrupts cycles of disintegration. The swords become mattocks not because violence was gently reasoned away, but because it could no longer be sustained in the presence of divine truth. Verse 5. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the law of the Lord. Following the pronouncements of divine judgment and the disarmament of nations, Isaiah pivots sharply into exhortation. The imperative voice, "Come ye, and let us walk," is neither abstract nor addressed to the world in general. It is spoken directly to the house of Jacob, the covenant community of Israel. This is a reassertion of identity, not through sentiment, but through motion. The people are summoned not to feel something, but to walk, and the path is not invented by them, it is given. They are to walk in the law of the Lord, meaning in the already revealed will and ordering of God. The triadic logic of this verse is causal, tracing a sequence that is not only theological, but also anthropological. First comes covenant identity, the acknowledgement of who the people are in relation to God. From this emerges communal worship, expressed not just in ritual but in shared action. The people rise together. Finally, that shared action produces harmonization with divine will. They walk in the law, aligning their lived structure with God's ordering of the cosmos. This is causal logic in full clarity. Identity gives rise to collective direction, which produces true ethical alignment. Remove the identity, and the whole causal chain collapses. But rightly ordered, it is a generative cycle. The people remember who they are, return together, and are restructured into righteousness. Isaiah is not merely calling for religious behavior. He is invoking the triadic architecture by which a people's existence regains coherence. This verse reveals something essential about divine causality. It does not begin with rules, but with belonging. You are the house of Jacob, therefore walk. The call to ethical obedience is not a burden laid upon outsiders, but an invitation extended to insiders who have forgotten who they are. Verse 6. Surely thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they are full of the east manners, and are sorcerers as the Philistines, and abound with strange children. What was affirmed in verse 5 is now overturned in verse 6. Here, God's forsaking of the people is not arbitrary. It is causally grounded in their own inversion of the covenantal structure. The people have not merely drifted, they have filled themselves with foreign customs, taken on the practices of neighboring nations, and produced a generation that no longer knows its spiritual lineage. What is presented here is not integration or multicultural synthesis, it is displacement, a deliberate substitution of one cultural religious order for another. This triad follows the logic of reversion. It inverts the causal order of right spiritual formation. Instead of identity leading to direction and ethical alignment, we see the unraveling in reverse. First comes syncretism, the adoption of incompatible religious patterns. This leads to cultural displacement. The lived habits of the people no longer reflect the law of the Lord, but mimic foreign cultic systems, Philistine sorcery and Eastern customs. Finally, the result is identity fragmentation, a people abounding in strange children, not merely ethnically mixed, but spiritually unmoored. The term here evokes a generation that does not carry the memory, law, or love of God in its bones. This reversal is not passive. It is causal reversion. The people did not merely forget, they actively replaced. The divine forsaking, then, is not divine abandonment, but the recognition of mutual disassociation. The people no longer inhabit the covenantal logic, and so the blessings of that logic no longer cohere around them. What this reveals is a profound spiritual truth. Covenantal identity is not static. It must be inhabited and transmitted through worship and alignment. When this sequence breaks, when worship no longer flows from identity and law no longer governs motion, the very image of the people is altered. Reversion doesn't simply undo the good. It replaces it with a mirrored logic, one that retains structure but reorients it toward confusion. This is not cultural commentary, it is theological warning. When cause and effect are inverted, the soul doesn't merely lose its path, it manufactures another, one that looks active but leads nowhere. The house of Jacob remains in name, but no longer in essence. Verse 7. Their land also was full of silver and gold, and there was none end of their treasures, and their land was full of horses, and their chariots were infinite. The language of fullness here is important. Isaiah describes a society that is overflowing, abundant in wealth, mobility, and organized power. The silver and gold signify material blessing, not merely prosperity, but the potential for durability, security, and resourcing of communal life. The horses evoke power of motion, both literal and symbolic, the ability to move, act, respond, and extend influence. The chariots, described as infinite, point to a complex infrastructure, a people with tools of coordination and collective action. These are not accidental features. They represent a civilization at peak capacity. At this stage, nothing in the text condemns these things directly. This is what makes the triad so potent. We are shown first blessing, then power, and finally a complex potential, the raw materials of spiritual greatness. The people are positioned, quite literally, with everything they need to serve something higher. Yet that higher calling is not made explicit here. The wealth, motion, and structure exist, but their purpose remains undefined. The significance of this abundance will only become clear in the next moment, when its use is revealed. This is the logic of the nonlinear. The initial state appears neutral or even good, blessing and power. The middle state expands it, infrastructure and capability. But it is only when the final state emerges that we understand whether the sequence was rightly oriented. Isaiah sets us up with a portrait of power, but pauses before assigning meaning. Verse 8. Their land was also full of idols. They worshipped the work of their own hands, which their own fingers have made. Now the meaning comes into view. The same hands that gathered gold, yoked horses, and built chariots have used that capacity not to reflect the divine image, but to construct false gods. The wealth of verse 7 did not flow toward justice or worship. It looped back into itself and created idols. This is not just materialism, it is creative inversion, the turning of human ability against its own source. The hands given for worship and service now produce objects of devotion in their own likeness. This reveals the full arc of the triad. We began with blessing, silver and gold, passed through mobility and force, horses and chariots, but now arrive at a spiritual outcome that redefines everything, the worship of what we make instead of what made us. Only now, with the emergence of form worship, does the abundance of verse 7 reveal its deeper tragedy. The wealth and infrastructure were not evil, they were empty, and into that emptiness rushed the self-making, self-veneration, self-fragmentation. This teaches us a core insight of the non-linear pattern. Beginnings can deceive. What looks like grace can become judgment if its trajectory bends inward. Material blessing and structured power only become spiritual capacity when they point beyond themselves. Otherwise, the same structures that could build temples will build idols, and the capacity meant for communion with God becomes the engine of confusion. Isaiah doesn't oppose abundance, he exposes its direction. Without right aim, even blessings become snares. The divine logic here is not economic, it is moral. Power misaligned doesn't just fail, it inverts. And when inversion becomes worship, the fall is not just inevitable, it's already begun. Verse 9. And a man bowed himself and a man humbled himself, therefore spare them not. At first glance, this verse appears to describe piety, acts of humility and reverence. But Isaiah is not fooled. He discerns that these gestures are not directed toward the living God, but toward idols, the products of human invention. What looks like devotion is in fact distortion. The bowing is not submission to truth, but capitulation to falsehood. This is a performance, and Isaiah unmasks it. This moment reveals the prophetic function at its sharpest. Not just to proclaim truth, but to expose falsity masquerading as righteousness. The prophet cuts through surface appearance with spiritual clarity, a vision that discerns not just action, but motive and aim. To the undiscerning, the bowing seems noble. To the prophet, it signals betrayal. The final clause is startling in its directness, therefore spare them not. This is not divine wrath as arbitrary vengeance, but the consequence of willful inversion. The justice that follows is not merely punitive, it is diagnostic. When false humility seeks shelter in the language of worship, it undermines not only truth, but the community bound to it. Inclusion into divine life cannot coexist with the institutionalization of spiritual fraud. Mercy in such cases becomes misalignment. Justice, rightly understood, reasserts the boundary between form and truth. The divine order welcomes all, but only through truth. And thus discernment leads to justice, not sentiment. The inclusion pattern here teaches us something subtle and vital. To be included in God's order is not simply to show up. It is to be rightly aligned, not just outwardly but inwardly. The prophet stands in that liminal space, calling the people in, but only through truth. Verse 10. Enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust from before the fear of the Lord, and from the glory of his majesty. The response to divine judgment when one has refused clarity is not repentance but retreat. Verse 10 shows the aftermath of exclusion. The false worshippers, exposed and unmasked, flee not just from danger, but from presence. They hide themselves in rock and dust, the elemental shelters of a creation they once tried to control. The fear of the Lord here is not abstract terror, but the unbearable weight of divine glory confronting a soul that has structured itself around illusion. This is fear in the form of collapse. The presence of God has not changed. It is still majesty, still holiness. But now, to the idolatrous mind, it appears unbearable, even destructive. Not because God has turned cruel, but because illusion cannot survive proximity to the real. Holiness is not violent, it is clarifying. And to those who have built their identity around self-made forms, such clarity feels like annihilation. The triad of withdrawal, isolation, and fear of holiness shows what happens when the logic of inclusion is refused. The very light meant to guide becomes for them a consuming fire, not because it changed, but because they did. What should lead to communion leads instead to burial. The people retreat into the rocks, symbol of solidity, but now grave-like in meaning. They dust themselves not in contrition but in avoidance. The path of return is still open, but they do not walk it. This teaches us the logic of exclusion, not as God pushing people away, but as the soul fleeing what it refuses to accept. Divine justice makes truth visible. Inclusion requires participation in that visibility. Exclusion is not imposed, it is chosen through fear and the refusal to be seen. Verse 11. The high look of man shall be humbled, and the loftiness of men shall be abased, and the Lord only shall be exalted in that day. This verse delivers one of the central affirmations of Isaiah's vision, the reordering of creation according to divine reality. It begins with the confrontation of pride, not as a psychological state, but as a spiritual structure. The high look and the loftiness of men are not incidental human emotions. They are the visible markers of an internal refusal to depend on God. They point to systems of self-sufficiency, cultural arrogance, and moral autonomy that deny the creaturely condition. These are not just expressions of personal sin, but symptoms of structural delusion. But the real turning point is that day, a phrase Isaiah uses to name moments of divine unveiling. It is not merely a future point in time, but the moment when reality asserts itself in a way that can no longer be denied. The Lord is not exalted because others are lowered. Rather, when false elevation is removed, his primacy becomes clear. This is the essence of the conjoined pattern. Human elevation collapses not through external punishment, but as a necessary condition for the proper recognition of the divine. God's exaltation and human humbling are not competitive. They are mutually necessary for the world to be rightly ordered. This triad teaches us the logic of divine recentering. When false hierarchies collapse, it does not result in nihilism or despair, but in revelation. The Lord was never absent. He was obscured. When pride is undone, the real architecture of the cosmos becomes visible. The point is not humiliation for its own sake, but moral realignment, where humans are resituated not as gods, but as participants in a sacred order. The eschatological reversal is not a reversal of power, but of illusion. Only what is truly high can remain when the scaffolds fall. Verse 12. For the day of the Lord of hosts is upon all the proud and haughty, and upon all that is exalted, and it shall be made low. This verse takes the insight of verse 11 and broadens it until no system, person, or structure is exempt. The day of the Lord of hosts is no longer a future abstraction. It is active, present, and comprehensive. The scope is total. All the proud, all that is exalted. This is not a list of individual sinners, but an indictment of collective patterns. Entire civilizations built on self-exaltation, spiritual arrogance, or the projection of power without foundation. Every high thing, Isaiah says, will fall, not as a punishment, but as the only outcome when the real encounters the false. This is the logic of conjoined negation, where one collapse implies another. The proud do not simply fall, they reveal that the very system of self-made greatness is unsustainable. What looks solid is hollow. What appears high is built on vapor. And once the true measure of the cosmos reasserts itself, these towers of illusion implode under their own unreality. It is not that God needs to push them down, they cannot stand in his light. This triad names the structure of judgment as universal unveiling. It is not partial, not vindictive, and not erratic. It is cosmic clarity. And in that clarity, anything not rooted in divine truth is exposed as fraud. What pretended to be exalted is shown to be weightless, and what appeared permanent dissolves into the dust it tried to deny. Together, verses 11 and 12 teach us that exaltation without God is not just morally wrong, it is ontologically impossible. When the day of the Lord arrives, whether in history or in the soul, there is no room for double structures. All elevation must be rejoined to truth or else made low. This is not cruelty, it is the mercy of ultimate exposure. Verse 13. Even upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and exalted, and upon all the oaks of Bashan, This verse continues Isaiah's poetic catalogue of elevation, but here we pause to consider what might be seen as legitimate greatness. The cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan were more than symbols of economic or military power. They represented the finest of what the natural world could offer. In the biblical imagination, they stood for beauty, resilience, stature, and usefulness. Natural objects elevated not by human pride, but by divine design. To invoke them is not immediately to condemn, but to name forms of elevation that are at least potentially good. Taken in an affirming light, the cedars and oaks become symbols of human greatness, rightly aligned with the created order. Their height is not artificial, it is earned through growth. Their roots dig deep into the earth, drawing strength slowly, steadily. They do not climb by conquest, but rise as a gift of nature's internal laws. And their prominence serves not only themselves, but the ecosystem. They provide shelter, structure, and beauty. Thus, this triad teaches us the logic of harmonic integration. When greatness emerges from what is rooted, when strength is received rather than seized, and when elevation leads others upward, then human aspiration becomes constructive. This is the logic of natural authority. Greatness that emerges from fidelity to purpose. Strength that does not dominate but holds. Aspiration that builds others rather than standing over them. Such qualities, Isaiah suggests, have a place in God's world. They are not idols, they are offerings, markers of what it means to reflect divine craftsmanship through our full flourishing. Not all that rises is proud. Some heights are holy. Verse 14. And upon all the high mountains and upon all the hills that are lifted up. But if verse 13 reflects a vision of greatness organically grounded, verse 14 shows us the inversion of that vision. What happens when elevation is engineered, exaggerated, or enforced? High mountains and hills that are lifted up point not to natural features but to symbolic structures, forms of power, prestige, and sovereignty that do not rise from integrity, but are hoisted by human pride. These are towers of Babel in geological disguise, institutions, ideologies, and authorities that present themselves as unshakable, but are hollow at their core. This triad shows us the failure of harmonic negation, the dissonance that occurs when forms of power no longer serve what they appear to represent. The hills may look like the cedars of Lebanon from a distance, but they lack root, purpose, and proportion. They ascend not through growth, but through assertion. And though they claim permanence, their height is cosmetic, only as stable as the pride that fuels them. The difference between the two verses is not elevation, but source. Isaiah is not anti-greatness. He is anti-vanity disguised as greatness. Verse 13 offers a picture of how created strength can serve the divine, reflecting the real beauty of nature's hierarchy. Verse 14 exposes what happens when human pride mimics that form without substance. False sovereignty always imitates true majesty, but only until the day of the Lord arrives and the lifted hills crumble like dust. Taken together, these verses form a mirror of aspiration. One shows what we might become if we grow in harmony with the order of creation. The other, what we manufacture when we reject that order and build on illusion. Only one will remain when the truth is revealed. Verse 15. And upon every high tower and upon every strong wall, Isaiah now shifts focus from nature and false elevation to human-built structures, towers and walls, inviting us to examine not simply what has been created, but how and why. On their surface, towers and walls are architectural elements, but in the biblical imagination they are also symbols of cultural coherence and moral orientation. Towers suggest elevated perspective, vigilance, and the ability to see danger from afar, representing a society's watchfulness over its moral and spiritual condition. Walls, meanwhile, signal boundaries, not of exclusion in the modern political sense, but of sanctification, defining what is within and without, preserving what is holy from what might corrupt it. Taken together in an affirming light, these structures express the logic of convergence, the drawing together of resources, values, perception, and spiritual attentiveness into a unified cultural form. Civilization here is not a neutral term. It becomes the visible enactment of integrity. The high tower becomes an emblem of principled oversight, and the strong wall a symbol of communal trust. In such a society, form reflects function. Elevation correlates with responsibility, and defense is aligned with moral clarity, not paranoia or exclusion. This convergence is what allows a covenantal people not just to survive, but to remain intelligible to themselves and to God. This is the sacred architecture of meaning. The structures we build are more than material. They reflect our collective intent, our ethical center, and the way we imagine the world ought to be. Towers and walls, rightly conceived, are not fortresses of fear, but containers of life and purpose. They do not isolate, they integrate. And in this triad, Isaiah shows us a society where civic form becomes spiritual symbol. Verse 16, "And upon all the ships of Tarshish and upon all pleasant pictures." But the next verse turns sharply, revealing what happens when these forms are hollowed out, when convergence collapses into divergence. The ships of Tarshish, a biblical image for distant trade and vast mercantile reach, are no longer vessels of sacred exchange. They become emblems of economic ambition, untethered from divine law. Likewise, the pleasant pictures, which could be taken as art, ornament, or even propaganda, cease to point toward higher realities and become tools of seduction, images designed to please the eye without nourishing the soul. Here, Isaiah names the logic of divergence, a fragmentation in which surface replaces substance, and form no longer protects meaning but obscures it. The tower and wall, verse 15, represented alignment. Here the ship and picture represent dispersion. Commerce, once a means of sustaining a people, becomes an end in itself. Aesthetics, once the visual grammar of reverence, becomes a distraction from truth. In this system, wealth is no longer stewardship, and beauty is no longer a pointer to the divine. It is all display, polished illusions masking internal disintegration. This negated triad reveals the deep crisis of a society no longer anchored by spiritual integrity. Trade, art, and culture persist, but without coherence. The walls that once held meaning are replaced by images that offer only sensation. The towers that once watched over a people are replaced by ships seeking profit across the seas. What was once a container of the holy becomes a theater for the self. The result is not simply corruption but confusion. A world where what is beautiful may be least true, and what is admired may be furthest from what matters. In this contrast, Isaiah forces us to ask, do our structures unify or scatter? Do our creations safeguard life or sell it off piecemeal in the name of influence and display? Convergence constructs civilization with an eye to eternity. Divergence dismantles it for the sake of ego. Verse 17, "And the haughtiness of men shall be brought low, and the loftiness of men shall be abased, and the Lord shall only be exalted in that day." This verse returns us to the spiritual climax of Isaiah's vision, a moment when all that is illusory, self-inflated, or falsely secured is brought low, and only what is truly eternal is revealed to stand. Isaiah is not describing a generic punishment of pride. He is describing the collapse of the false self. The haughtiness and loftiness here are not merely personal sins, but entire structures of self-conception, systems of ego, cultural arrogance, institutional idolatry, and ideological inflation that resist dependence upon God. These are not just attitudes, they are edifices built in the soul and the society. But Isaiah insists that the exaltation of the Lord is not something imposed upon the world from above. It is what becomes apparent when everything else falls away. When the illusions built by man are humbled and abased, when the pretense is removed, the glory of the Lord is not introduced, it is manifest. This is not humiliation for its own sake. It is transformation through unveiling. God does not compete with our loftiness, He waits for its collapse. And when it falls, the landscape of the real emerges, not wrathful but clear, absolute, inarguable. This teaches us the logic of combination, not in the sense of harmony but of confrontation. The triad unfolds like a collision of realities, The false self is brought down, pretense collapses, and what was always true is finally seen. The self, the lie, and the truth are not three separate things, but layers of a single spiritual drama. When they are allowed to combine, to be held in the light of one another, truth is revealed, and the false dissolves in its presence. What remains is not devastation, but the Lord alone, exalted, visible, irreducible. Verse 18, and the idols will he utterly destroy. If verse 17 is the internal collapse of the egoic self, verse 18 is the external collapse of its projection. The idols, those visible, tangible objects formed by hands and minds in the image of man rather than God, are not debated. They are not disassembled for parts or softened for cultural adaptation. They are utterly destroyed. Isaiah gives no room for reinterpretation or symbolic rescue. What was false cannot be redeemed by rebranding. This is a judgment not of taste, but of ontology. The idols do not merely mislead, they do not exist as real centers of power. Their destruction is not subtraction from reality, it is the subtraction of unreality. Here we are taught the logic of division, but not fragmentation in the chaotic sense. This is division as purification, the necessary severing of truth from illusion. In the logic of combination, the false self is allowed to collapse so that the Lord may be revealed. In the logic of division, what pretended to share in the divine is rejected from that union altogether. The idol and the image of God are separated decisively. There is no mixture, no gray zone, no ambiguity left. What is divine is what remains. What was human projection is unmade. This division is not merely iconoclastic rage, it is mercy. For so long as idols stand, the soul remains confused. Worship is divided, allegiance is split, and the human spirit wanders between realities. The destruction of idols is therefore a grace. It liberates the worshipper from his own deception. What we see here is not just the end of certain practices, but the collapse of an entire worldview. The worldview that believed man could craft his gods, that illusion could hold power, that form could replace essence. So these two verses, first the fall of the self, then the fall of its external projections, complete a single movement. They expose the full cycle of combination and division. The self and its creations are finally seen together and therefore finally separated. In that clarity, worship begins. Verse 19. Then shall they go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth from before the fear of the Lord and from the glory of his majesty when he shall arise to destroy the earth. In this verse, we witness the aftermath of revelation, not as received doctrine, but as a shattering encounter. The divine is no longer merely heard or spoken about. It is experienced as overwhelming majesty. The fear of the Lord here is not emotional panic or terror in a human sense. It is the proper existential response when truth appears in its undiluted power. That fear is the threshold of wisdom because it is the recognition that one stands before a reality which cannot be contained, ignored, or assimilated. The imagery of holes and caves is significant. These are not just hiding places. They are elemental shelters, symbolic returns to the most primal forms of refuge. They suggest not rebellion, but stunned humility, even repentance. The people retreat into the deepest parts of the earth, not to escape destruction, but to reorient themselves in the presence of majesty they are no longer prepared to stand before. This withdrawal is reverent, not cynical. It is a bodily admission that something has been fundamentally misunderstood, and that continued exposure would burn rather than illumine. We are taught here the logic of association. Revelation initiates not just insight, but displacement. One must find a new context in which to stand in relation to the truth now unveiled. Insight does not remain still. It destabilizes old allegiances and calls forth new environments of reception. To associate with the divine properly, the soul must realign. Withdrawal is the beginning of that movement, not its end. Fear, then, is not the rejection of God, but the painful evidence that one's former self cannot yet bear him. And so the confrontation with truth becomes not annihilation, but the painful first gesture of transformation, to see, to tremble, and to step away in order that one might return rightly changed. Verse 20. At that day shall man cast away his silver idols and his golden idols, which they had made themselves to worship them, to the moles and to the backs. The collapse that began in verse 19 reaches its symbolic culmination here. When the divine glory rises, the idols fall, not ceremonially, not slowly, but violently and with finality. Those who once cherished these symbols, crafted from silver and gold, precious both materially and imaginatively, now throw them into the depths of the earth. Not only are these objects no longer desirable, they are repulsive, shameful, alien. Their very presence is now unbearable in the light of the majesty just revealed. But more than shame is happening here. There is disinheritance. The idols are not only discarded, the inner world that sustained them is now untenable. The man is not just abandoning an object, he is exiling his former self. And look where they are thrown. Not to fire for purification, but to the moles and the bats. These are creatures of blindness and inversion who dwell in the inverted rhythms of the earth. To place the idols with them is to acknowledge the full reversal of the previous order. The upside-down kingdom of delusion is now recognized for what it was. Not divine mimicry, but spiritual deformity. This teaches us the logic of disassociation. What was once central is now expelled, but the danger is not over. The soul may now abandon not only the idol, but the inner connection to what formed the truth in the first place. Association seeks new structures in the aftermath of revelation, but disassociation runs the risk of severing the self from the very processes, prophetic insight, ethical clarity, and humility that made revelation possible. The gold and silver idols are not merely lies, they were the soul's attempt to grasp power, form, and control. Their casting away is not heroic, it is the soul's confession that it worshipped what it made, not what it was made by. Disassociation, then, is both liberation and risk. For unless the void left by the fallen idols is filled with true presence, the house swept clean may again be filled with worse illusions. The divine confrontation must lead forward, or else disassociation becomes estrangement, and insight is lost in the retreat. Verse 21. To go into the holes of the rocks, and into the tops of the ragged rocks, from before the fear of the Lord, and from the glory of his majesty, when he shall rise to destroy the earth. This verse mirrors language used earlier in verse 19, but it is not a repetition, it is a deepening. Where verse 19 introduced fear and retreat, verse 21 renders those actions more chaotic and irreversible. Here the people are not simply hiding from the presence of God, they are disintegrating under it. Their scattering into holes of the rocks and tops of the ragged rocks is not symbolic of strategic withdrawal, but of complete spiritual destabilization. They move in opposite directions, some plunging downward into caves, others ascending toward jagged peaks. There is no center, no unity, no agreed response. What we are witnessing is the implosion of coherence in the soul and the society. And what drives this fragmentation? Not violence, but glory. The fear of the Lord and the glory of his majesty do not kill them, they reveal them. When the divine presence rises, it does not need to speak to destroy. It simply is, and in being fully manifest, it renders falsehood impossible to maintain. The people cannot endure what has been shown, not because it is evil, but because they are unprepared for the truth it makes undeniable. This is what the pattern of disintegration teaches us. First, the people withdraw from glory, not because it has injured them, but because they cannot stand in its light without seeing themselves as they truly are. That rupture of relationship with divine presence then leads to a flight from discernment. When the soul refuses to face truth, it also loses the ability to interpret it. In such a condition, the person does not reason, they react. And in that reactive state, the final consequence is the evacuation of selfhood. Without a stable point of alignment, without a shared moral center or internal compass, the self cannot endure. What remains is a shell of survival, a being fragmented by the very light meant to unify. Verse 22. Cease you from the man whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be esteemed? The chapter ends not with a description, but with a command. Cease. A single imperative carries the full weight of prophetic summation. But this is no arbitrary instruction, it is precise and revelatory. The call is not to reject humanity, but to release our idolatry of it. The verse identifies the man whose breath is in his nostrils, a poetic way of naming the fragility of life. Breath is transient. It is not essence, not permanence, not divinity. It is the mark of all that is passing. And yet, it is this very kind of man, impermanent, vulnerable, dependent, who has been exalted as the source of truth, power, and meaning. The verse calls that error to account. The pattern of integration opens here. First, there is the confrontation with mortality. This is not morbid, but liberating. We are not gods. We are not the source of our own breath. The acknowledgement of that fact is not humiliation. It is the beginning of sanity. When we cease to project godhood onto man, we begin to see reality clearly. From there, the verse moves us to recognize the ephemeral nature of authority. Human systems, hierarchies, cultures, and achievements, all of them are temporary. They have a role, but not a throne. Their collapse in the face of divine truth is not tragedy, but cleansing. What cannot last should not be worshipped, and it is only from within that cleared space that the final insight of the pattern emerges. Divine alignment. When false esteem ends, right relationship begins. The cease of verse 22 is not a negation of value, but a redirection of reverence. Humanity, freed from the burden of false divinity, can finally take up its true calling, not as the measure of all things, but as the image-bearer of the one who is. Integration is not fusion, it is harmony. The soul recenters not by dissolving into the divine, but by standing in truth in its rightful place, restored and clarified. Thus the chapter closes as it began, with a vision of the word seen, not received from below but revealed from above. It is the truth of things unveiled by glory, and the invitation hidden in the command to cease is that such truth once faced need not destroy us. It can save us. Isaiah 2 does not simply describe a future world. It reveals the hidden structures shaping our present one. At first glance, it appears to oscillate between hope and judgment, peace and collapse. But as the chapter unfolds, a deeper pattern emerges, a precise architecture of triadic logic in which affirmation and negation interlock to expose the true state of a people, a culture, and a world out of alignment with its source. This is not a prophecy to be passively observed. It is a map to be read with the full weight of moral, spiritual, and communal urgency. The high places you trust, the idols you build, the structures you inhabit. Isaiah is not asking whether they exist, but whether they can stand when the light of divine reality confronts them. Do your forms contain truth or only echo its shape? Is your reverence grounded in revelation or in images of your own making? When the day of the Lord comes, not someday, but whenever reality breaks through illusion, what remains? What this chapter demands is not sentiment, but clarity. Here is a vision in which every structure, cultural, religious, personal, is tested not by opinion, but by glory. What you walk in, what you bow to, what you build, all of it is either converging toward the divine or disintegrating into the dust. Isaiah is not simply speaking to Judah and Jerusalem. He is speaking to any people who would dare to center themselves without centering truth. The command at the end is not a threat, it is an invitation. Cease from man, whose breath is in his nostrils. Let go of illusions dressed as permanence. Step away from self-made sovereignty. And behold, not a ruin, but a revelation. The Lord alone shall be exalted. The false must fall, but only so the real can stand. This is not the end of vision. It is where true vision begins.